Okay, in this video, we're going to read Paul Grice's paper, Meaning. And one interesting thing about this paper, Grice is writing in the late 1950s, which is the beginning of what they call ordinary language philosophy. He's trying to understand how words are used in ordinary language to try to solve philosophical puzzles. And in particular, he's interested in this question of why do words mean what they do? And the clever thing that he's trying to do is he's going to shift the question. Instead of considering why do words mean what they do, he's going to ask what does it take for a person to mean something in using a word? And in order to answer that, he has to distinguish meaning in the sense of language from other notions of meaning. And so he's going to begin by making this distinction and eventually come to the idea about the role that intentions and trust play in understanding what meaning is in the linguistic sense. He never answers the question, what is it for a word to mean something? But I think he does give an interesting case for what it is for a person to mean something. Okay, so consider the following sentences. Those spots mean measles, or those spots meant measles. Those spots didn't mean anything to me, but to the doctor they meant measles. The recent budget means that we shall have a hard year. And here he's giving examples of one type of the use of the word meaning. He says, first, I cannot say, those spots meant measles, but he hadn't got measles. And I can't say, the recent budget means that we shall have a hard year, but we shan't have. And here we notice the first indication that Grice is very British in the way he uses the language. Uh, that is to say, in cases like the above, X meant that P and X means that P entail P. In other words, you can't mean something in this way unless the thing that is meant is true. Second, I cannot argue from those spots mean measles to any conclusion about what is meant by those spots. Here he's using the passive voice, what is meant. For example, I'm not entitled to say, what was meant by these spots was that he had measles. Equally, I cannot draw from the statement about the recent budget the conclusion, what is meant by the recent budget is that we shall have a hard year. Third observation, I cannot argue from those spots meant measles to any conclusion to the effect that somebody or other meant by those spots so and so. I think this is the same as the previous point. A passive voice, what was meant by those spots? Well, in order for something to be meant by, it has to be meant by someone. And he's saying here, those spots mean measles. There is no person who means measles by those spots. Mutatis mutandis, the same is true of the sentence about the recent budget. And mutatis mutandis is just a Latin phrase meaning changing what needs to be changed. 4. For none of the above examples can a restatement be found in which the verb mean is followed by a sentence or phrase in inverted commas. And here inverted commas is just British for quotation marks. Thus, those spots meant measles cannot be reformulated as those spots meant measles, or those spots meant he has measles. The idea is there's no sentence that means the thing that those spots mean. On the other hand, for all these examples, an approximate restatement can be found, beginning with the phrase, the fact that. For example, the fact that he had those spots meant that he had measles. And the fact that the recent budget was as it was means that we shall have a hard year. Now, contrast the above sentences with the following. And here he's going to get to the other kind of meaning, the one that he's most interested in. Those 3 rings on the bell of the bus mean that the bus is full. That remark, Smith couldn't get on without his trouble and strife, meant that Smith found his wife indispensable. And if you don't understand that phrase, we might look up Cockney rhyming slang. This was a popular type of slang in Britain in the middle of the 20th century, and I think still to some extent. And there's a lot of examples. And if we go to wife, we see that trouble and strife is the word that they use. If you want to talk about a yank, you call him a septic tank. If you want to talk about a fart, you call it a raspberry tart. And that's the rhyming slang. Okay, so again, you can see why someone might be trying to explain what someone meant by that sentence, but he's saying these are examples where we are indicating the kind of meaning he's interested in. And now he has similar observations about these kinds of meaning. First, I can use the first of these and go on to say, but it isn't in fact full. The conductor has made a mistake. That is, we can say, those three rings mean that the bus is full, but it isn't in fact full. The conductor has made a mistake. I can say, the remark, Smith couldn't get on without his trouble and strife, meant that Smith found his wife indispensable. But in fact, Smith deserted her 7 years ago. That is to say, in these cases, X means that P and X meant that P do not entail that P is true. You can mean something even though it's false, even though the spots can't mean measles without there being measles. 2. I can argue from the first to some statement about what was meant by the rings on the bell, and from the second to some statement about what was meant by the quoted remark. And in fact, that might be exactly what I said. What was meant by the phrase trouble and strife was wife. 3. I can argue from the first sentence to the conclusion that somebody, viz. the conductor, meant, or at any rate should have meant, by the rings that the bus is full. And I can argue analogously for the second sentence. That is, I think he's, in these cases, saying the rings mean the bus is full, or the sentence means Smith found his wife indispensable. But in both cases, there is a person who means something by using the bell, and there's a person who means something by using that sentence. And in all these examples, he's talking about arguing from. That's an idea from logic. That is the idea that one sentence leads to another. In these cases, some of the sentences involving the word mean lead to conclusions that someone must have meant it, whereas the other sentences involving mean, like the ones about measles, don't lead to the conclusion that somebody meant measles. And this word viz, it's one of those Latin abbreviations that I've never looked up. Maybe I should look it up right now. Uh, let's see, viz, it's a synonym for namely, and it's short for Latin videlicet, or videre licet. It is permitted to see. Okay, that's weird, but always something good to know. Fourth, the first sentence can be restated in a form in which the verb mean is followed by a phrase in inverted commas, quotation marks. That is, those three rings on the bus mean, quote, the bus is full. So also can the second sentence. 5. Such a sentence as, the fact that the bell has been rung 3 times means that the bus is full, is not a restatement of the meaning of the first sentence. Both may be true, but they do not have, even approximately, the same meaning. And I'm not quite so sure I get exactly what he's saying here, but I think the idea is those three rings mean that the bus is full. That doesn't tell us anything about what happened, what this fact must have meant. And I guess the idea is uh, I can imagine we're in a context where people ring the bell whenever the bus is full, but someone accidentally rang the bell this time. And so we wouldn't say, in this case, the fact that the bell has been rung means that the bus is full, even if the bell is the bus is full bell. So when the expressions means something, means that, are used in the kind of way in which they're used in the first set of sentences, the ones about measles, or the ones that smoke means fire, or that the budget means we'll have trouble, I shall speak of the sense or senses in which they are used as natural sense, or senses of the expression in question. When the expressions are used in the kind of way in which they're used in the second set of sentences, the ones about the bell or about the rhyming slang, I shall speak of the sense or senses in which they are used as the non-natural sense of the expressions in question. I shall use the abbreviation means subscript NN to distinguish the non-natural sense or senses. And I think the idea is that natural phenomena mean things all the time, like spots mean measles, smoke means fire, in that first way, but it's only human or artificial things that mean in this second way. I propose for convenience also to include under the head of natural senses of mean, such senses of mean as may be exemplified in sentences by the pattern, A means to do so and so, where A is a human agent. And I think this, I'm not sure if this is used as often in English, but in British, I mean in American, but in British English, you might say, I mean to go to the store on Saturday. And that's what we would in American English say is, I intend to go to the store on Saturday. And, uh, and British and Australian friends of mine often say things like, oh, you're meant to wear a mask whenever you go there, meaning you're supposed to wear a mask whenever it goes there. But that's a use of meaning that, again, he's not concerned with. The one he's concerned with is the one about what do sentences mean and things like the rings of the bus or the or street signs. By contrast, I shall, as the previous examples show, I include under the head of non-natural senses of mean any senses of mean found in sentences of the pattern A means something by X, or A means by X that. This is over-rigid, but it will serve as an indication. I do not want to maintain that all our uses of mean fall easily, obviously, and tidy into one of the two groups I have distinguished, but I think that in most cases we should be at least fairly strongly inclined to assimilate our use of mean to one group rather than to the other. I actually saw an interesting crossword puzzle in the New York Times a while back in which about a dozen of the clues were the word mean, and they had all sorts of meanings. There's other things he's not even considering here, things like average, or in statistics, or things like cruel. That's another way of being mean. But uh, so of course he's not talking about all the uses of the word meaning, but there's these two fairly closely related ones. Uh, the spots mean measles, or the rings of the bell of the bus mean that it's full. And he's distinguishing those and telling us what's different between them. So the question which now arises is this: what more can be said about the distinction between the cases where we should say that the word is applied in a natural sense and the cases where we should say that the word is applied in a non-natural sense? And again, he's using should here the way Americans would use would. Asking this question will not, of course, prohibit us from trying to give an explanation of meaning NN in terms of one or another natural sense of mean. This question about the distinction between non-natural and natural meaning is, I think, what people are getting at when they display an interest in a distinction between natural and conventional signs. This must have been a debate that was going around this time, but I think my formulation is better. For some things which can mean in this non-natural sense something are not signs, e.g. words are not. Uh, I'm not sure exactly what signs here means in that particular debate, but he's saying words are not signs. Uh, a word doesn't stand directly for something necessarily. And some are not conventional in any ordinary sense, e.g. certain gestures. Like when you wave your hands wildly, you might mean I'm over here, even though there may not be a convention that waving your hand that way is how you tell someone I'm over here. While some things which mean naturally are not signs of what they mean. CF, the recent budget example. And I think CF is another one of those abbreviations that's from Latin. In fact, let's see if I can find out what that one means. It's from the Latin confere, meaning to compare or consult. So yes, compare that recent budget example. And EG is example given or exemplia gratia. So for example. I want first to consider briefly and reject what I might term a causal type of answer to the question, what is meaning? And here, note, there's often a confusion in reading philosophy papers. Causal means having to do with cause and effect, and casual means like the opposite of formal. And here it's talking about causal. We might try to say, for instance, more or less with C.L. Stevenson, that, and here this is Charles Stevenson, and this is Charles Stevenson, the philosopher, who mainly did work in ethics and aesthetics, but he apparently said something about meaning in his book, Ethics and Language. So Stevenson says, for X to mean something in this non-natural sense, X must have, roughly, a tendency to produce in an audience some attitude, cognitive or otherwise, and a tendency in the case of a speaker to be produced by that attitude. These tendencies being dependent on an elaborate process of conditioning, attending the use of the sign in communication. So I think Stevenson is working in what you might think of as a behaviorist tradition in psychology, the idea that we're never going to really think about what's going on in the head. We're just going to look at what's the input and output behavior. And this was important in the early 20th century when psychologists wanted to become uh, more scientific in a certain way. They wanted to eliminate lots of speculation about what's going on in the head and just look at what's coming in and out. And then in the later 20th century, psychologists realized, no, we do have to think a lot more about what's going on inside the head. But the discipline of those behaviorist years was sort of helpful in developing modern cognitive psychology. But Stevenson is thinking, What it is to mean something is just to produce a certain response in the head of the hearer and to be produced uh, by the speaker in by the same attitude. And Grice says this clearly will not do. So 1. Let us consider a case where an utterance, if it qualifies at all as meaning something, will be of a descriptive or informative kind, and the relevant attitude therefore will be a cognitive one, for example, a belief. So I think Stevenson was interested in both cognitive attitudes like beliefs and non-cognitive attitudes like approval or disapproval, because he was working in ethics. So I use utterance here as a neutral word to apply to any candidate for meaning. It has a convenient act-object ambiguity. So that is, the rings of the bell are going to count as an utterance. And again, when he says the act-object ambiguity, utterance, the act of ringing the bell is an act of uttering, but the rings of the bell themselves are also an utterance. Similarly, my act of saying words is an utterance, but the words themselves are an utterance as well. And again, not the words really, we should think the concrete sounds coming out of my mouth. The words exist eternally and are not produced by me, but the sounds produced by my mouth are the utterance. So he says, it's no doubt that the case that many people have a tendency to put on a tailcoat when they think they're about to go to a dance, and it's no doubt also the case that many people, on seeing someone put on a tailcoat, would conclude that the person in question was about to go to a dance. This particular example obviously works better in 1957 than it does today. I don't know anyone who puts on a tailcoat when they go to a dance. So does this satisfy us that putting on a tailcoat means that one is about to go to a dance, or indeed means anything at all? So he's saying, Stevenson's theory says, if an attitude produces an utterance and the utterance produces the same attitude in another person, then the utterance means that thing. And Grice says, well, if thinking about going to a dance makes you put on a tailcoat, and putting on a tailcoat makes other people think you're going to the dance, then that fits Stevenson's theory. And then Grice says, obviously not. This putting on the tailcoat doesn't mean anything. It is no help to refer to the qualifying phrase dependent on an elaborate process of conditioning. For if all this means is that the response to the sight of a tailcoat being put on is in some way learned or acquired, it will not exclude the present case from being one of meaning. But if we have to take seriously the second part of the qualifying phrase, attending the use of the sign in communication, then the account of meaning is obviously circular. We might just as well say, X has meaning if it's used in communication, which is true, but not helpful. It doesn't tell us what meaning is if we say meaning is when you're communicating, because now we can just ask, well, what's communicating? 2, if this is not enough, there's a difficulty, really the same difficulty, I think, which Stevenson recognizes. How we're to avoid saying, for example, that Jones is tall is part of what is meant by Jones is an athlete, since to tell someone that Jones is an athlete would tend to make him believe that Jones is tall. Stevenson here resorts to invoking linguistic rules, namely a permissive rule of language that athletes may be non-tall. This amounts to saying that we are not prohibited by rule from speaking of non-tall athletes. But why are we not prohibited? Not because it's not bad grammar or it's not impolite and so on, but presumably because it's not meaningless, or if this is too strong, does not in any way violate the rules of meaning for the expressions concerned. But this seems to involve us in another circle. So this whole objection, I'm not quite sure I understand what is going on here, but I think it's not too much for us to worry about. Moreover, one wants to ask why, if it's legitimate to appeal here to rules to distinguish what is meant from what is suggested, this appeal was not made earlier in the case of groans, for example, to deal with which Stevenson originally introduced the qualifying phrase about dependence on conditioning. I think that is about an issue that Stevenson might have said, Stevenson's original account was where you just say uh, something means something if it's produced by a mental state and produces the same mental state. And the challenge was that when you're feeling unwell, that causes you to groan. And when you hear someone groan, that causes you to think that this person is unwell. And Stevenson says, that's not really meaning because that's something that everyone understands without having learned it. And so he wanted meaning to be a case with that causal pattern that people learned. And then Grice said, the example with the tailcoat is a case with that causal pattern that people learned. But yet we still don't want to say that putting on the tailcoat in the ordinary case is an act with meaning. A further deficiency, and the reason is because it's something that isn't involved in communication, and so we'll get to that later on. Again, we haven't said yet what communication is, but I think Grice's account will help us understand that. A further deficiency in a causal theory of the type just expounded seems to be that even if we accept it as it stands, we're furnished with an analysis only of statements about the standard meaning, or the meaning in general, of a sign. No provision is made for dealing with statements about what a particular speaker or writer means by a sign on a particular occasion, which may well diverge from the standard meaning of the sign. Think about someone who misuses a word. You might know what they mean, they might know what they mean, and yet the sign is not typically produced by that mental state and may not typically produce that same mental state. Nor is it obvious how the theory could be adapted to make such a provision. One might even go further in criticism and maintain that the causal theory ignores the fact that the meaning in general of a sign needs to be explained in terms of what users of the sign do or should mean by it on particular occasions. And so the latter notion, which is unexplained by the causal theory, is in fact the fundamental one. I'm sympathetic to this more radical criticism, though I'm aware that the point is controversial. And I think this is a central idea that Grice is dealing with. As we might put it later when we're talking about linguistics, pragmatics comes first and semantics follows from that. That is, first speakers mean things, people mean things by acts of communication, and then Grice wants to say, words and sentences only get their meaning because they're typically used by people with that meaning. But uh, the people mean things first and the words second. And this is an idea we'll come back to later in the course of the semester. And if you have challenges to that, great, let's discuss that in class because I think there's a lot to challenge about that and there's a lot that we'll come back to. But this is a really interesting and important idea by Grice. Okay, I do not propose to consider any further theories of the causal tendency type. I suspect no such theory could avoid difficulties analogous to those I have outlined without utterly losing its claim to rank as a theory of this type. I will now try a different and, I hope, more promising line. If we can elucidate the meaning of X meant something on a particular occasion, and X meant that so-and-so on a particular occasion, and A meant something by X. So I guess in the first case, X is the sentence or the utterance. So an utterance means something on a particular occasion, and then A meant something by X on a particular occasion. So a speaker means something by using this utterance. This might reasonably be expected to help us with X means in the timeless sense something that's so-and-so. So the idea is, if you want to say why trouble and strife means wife in Cockney slang, it'll be because on certain occasions, some individuals meant wife by using the phrase trouble and strife. And it's because those individuals meant it that the word came to have that meaning. And so Grice is going to tell what is it for an individual to mean something by use of an utterance. And so with the explication then of means the same as, understands, entails, and so on. So that's the idea that he's going to get all of that by first getting what it is for a person to mean something by using an utterance. So let us for the moment pretend that we have to deal only with utterances which might be informative or descriptive. And here the idea is to avoid considering what do questions mean, what do commands mean, what does poetry mean. Just think about informative or descriptive utterances. And I think this may be an important problem for the theory. We will discuss that more in class and later on about whether this limitation to informative or descriptive utterances is important. Okay, so a first shot would be to suggest that X meant something would be true if this utterance X was intended by its utterer to induce a belief in some audience, and that to say what the belief was would be to say what X meant. But this will not do. For instance, I might leave B's handkerchief near the scene of a murder in order to induce the detective to believe that B was the murderer. But we should not want to say that the handkerchief or my leaving it there meant anything, or that I had meant by leaving it that B was the murderer. I think he's imagining some case where I'm trying to frame B and I don't even want anyone to know what I'm doing. I'm trying to get someone to believe something by doing something, but that's not enough for it to count as meaning. So clearly we must at least add that for X, the utterance, to have meant anything, not merely must it have been uttered with the intention of inducing a certain belief, but also the utterer must have intended an audience to recognize the intention behind the utterance. So that's what's going wrong in the case of this framing. And now he says this, though perhaps better, is not good enough. Consider the following cases. 1. Herod presents Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist on a charger. So this is a famous story from the Bible. Salome, well, she had a complex relationship with John the Baptist, but eventually she wanted him dead, and her father Herod presents her with the head and shows her and causes her to believe he's dead. Second, feeling faint, a child lets its mother see how pale it is, hoping that she may draw her own conclusions and help. 3. I leave the china my daughter has broken lying around for my wife to see. Uh, Here we seem to have cases which satisfy the conditions so far given. For example, Herod intended to make Salome believe that St. John the Baptist was dead, and no doubt also intended Salome to recognize that he intended her to believe that. Similarly for the other cases. Yet I certainly do not think that we should want to say that we have here cases of meaning. So if your kid comes home and you see, or if you come home and you see that the kid's broken something and you leave that out to get your spouse to recognize what the kid's done, you're not telling anything to your spouse. You're not meaning anything to your spouse. This is something else, and Grice wants to say what that difference is. What we want to find is the difference between, for example, deliberately and openly letting someone know and telling, between getting someone to think and telling. The way out is perhaps as follows. Compare the following two cases. 1. I show Mr. X a photograph of Mr. Y displaying undue familiarity to Mrs. X. 2. I draw a picture of Mr. Y behaving in this manner and show it to Mr. X. I find that I want to deny that in one, the photograph or my showing it to Mr. X meant anything at all, while I want to assert in two that the picture or my drawing and showing it meant something, that Mr. Y had been unduly familiar, or at least that I had meant by it that Mr. Y had been unduly familiar. And note here it's probably important that he's dealing with this distinction between types of meaning that he talks about at the beginning. The photograph probably means what it depicts in the non-natural sense, in the natural sense, just like smoke means fire or spots mean measles, because in that case the photograph couldn't happen if it hadn't been true, and a photograph could mean that even if no one had meant anything by using the photograph. If there was just an automatic camera, a security camera, uh, and you look at this and you say, ah, this means that the burglars came in through the side door. That's not that someone meant that the burglars come in through the side door. Whereas if someone had drawn a picture of the burglars coming in through the side door, then we would say someone meant this by using this picture. So what's the difference between the two cases? Surely that in case one, where it's the photograph, Mr. X's recognition of my intention to make him believe that there's something between Mr. Y and Mrs. X is more or less irrelevant to the production of this effect by the photograph. Mr. X would be led by the photograph to suspect Mrs. X, even if instead of showing it to him, I left it in his room by accident, and I, the shower of the photograph, would not be unaware of this. But it will make a difference to the effect of my picture on Mr. X, whether or not he takes me to be intending to inform him, make him believe something about Mrs. X, and not to be just doodling or trying to produce a work of art. So that is, he's saying there's an important difference here. In the case of a photograph, it doesn't matter what I intend. It may be that I intend to convey something and the person might recognize it, but my intention itself doesn't really matter to them to believe it. Whereas when I draw a picture for someone, it really does matter that they recognize my intention. If they think I'm just drawing a picture because I'm doodling or fantasizing, they won't believe it. Whereas if they think I'm trying to communicate, then they will believe it. So now we've landed in a further difficulty if we accept this account. For consider now, say, frowning. If I frown spontaneously in the ordinary course of events, someone looking at me might well treat the frown as a natural sign of displeasure. But if I frown deliberately to convey my displeasure, an onlooker may be expected, provided he recognizes my intention, still to conclude that I am displeased. Ought we not then to say, since it could not be expected to make any difference to the onlooker's reaction whether he regards my frown as spontaneous or as intended to be informative, that my frown deliberate does not mean anything? I think here he's imagining a case where you and a friend are watching something together and you don't want to talk, but you're unhappy with what's going on, and you see your friend look over, and so you intentionally frown at them to let them know you don't like what's going on. And he says, I think this difficulty can be met. For though in general a deliberate frown may have the same effect as regards inducing belief in my displeasure as a spontaneous frown, it can be expected to have the same effect only provided the audience takes it as intended to convey displeasure. That is, if we take away the recognition of the intention, leaving the other circumstances, including the recognition of the frown, as deliberate, the belief-producing tendency of the frown must be regarded as being impaired or destroyed. That is, if you imagine you and a friend are watching this thing, and your friend sees you intentionally frown, they might, if they don't realize you're frowning in order to convey your displeasure, they might think, oh, maybe he's frowning because he's made up a code where he wants to frown to indicate that he's happy. So he says, perhaps we may sum up what is necessary for A to mean something by X as follows. A must intend to induce, by means of X, a belief in an audience, and he must also intend his utterance to be recognized as so intended. But these intentions are not independent. The recognition is intended by A to play its part in inducing the belief, and if it does not do so, something will have gone wrong with the fulfillment of A's intentions. Moreover, A's intending that the recognition should play this part implies, I think, that he assumes that there is some chance that it will in fact play this part, that he does not regard it as a foregone conclusion that the belief will be induced in the audience, whether or not the intention behind the utterance is recognized. Shortly, perhaps, we may say, A meant something by X is roughly equivalent to A uttered X with the intention of inducing a belief by means of the recognition of this intention. This seems to involve a reflexive paradox, but it does not really do so. That is, he's saying, the intention involves intending that the person recognizes this very intention. So there's some sort of circularity here. And he's saying this circularity is not paradoxical, not in the way that circularity in the sentence like this sentence is false is paradoxical. So he says, now perhaps it's time to drop the pretense that we have to deal with only with informative cases. Let us start with some examples of imperatives or quasi-imperatives. So he's going to say, now we can go beyond just the statements. I have a very avaricious man in my room, and I want him to go. So I throw a £1 note out the window. Is there here any utterance with a meaning? No, because in behaving as I did not intend his recognition of my purpose to be in any way effective in getting him to go. I think the idea is he's saying, I've got a greedy friend here, and I want to get this guy out of my room, so I just throw a dollar out the window. And if the guy's so greedy, he'll run out to get the dollar, and then I'll lock the door while he's gone. I don't care whether or not he recognizes what I'm doing. I just care that he's gone. This is parallel to the photograph case. If, on the other hand, I had pointed to the door or given him a little push, then my behavior might well be held to constitute a meaningful utterance, just because the recognition of my intention would be intended to be effective in speeding his departure. If I just point at the door, that's not going to get someone to go unless they recognize that I want them to go. If I just push him a little bit, that won't make him move unless he recognizes me pushing him is intending him to mean get out of the room. Another pair of cases would be, 1, a policeman who stops a car by standing in its way, and 2, a policeman who stops a car by waving. So that is, when the policeman stands in the way of the car, the cop doesn't care whether the person recognizes he wants the car to stop. He's just caring that the person doesn't want to hit someone and will stop. Whereas if the cop waves at the car, that's not going to get the person to stop unless the person recognizes that the policeman wants them to stop. Or to turn briefly to another type of case, if, as an examiner, I fail a man, I may well cause him distress or indignation or humiliation. And if I'm vindictive, I may intend this effect and even intend him to recognize my intention. Here, Grice is giving you a bit of the dirty side of the other side of classes. I should not be inclined to say that my failing him meant anything. That is, even if I intend to humiliate a student by failing them, giving them the failing a grade is not an utterance with meaning. On the other hand, if I cut someone in the street, I do feel inclined to assimilate this to the cases of meaning. And this inclination seems to me dependent on the fact that I could not reasonably expect him to be distressed unless he recognized my intention to affect him in this way. I don't exactly know what this means, this British slang cut someone in the street. I'm not sure what that means. CF, if my college stopped my salary altogether, I should accuse them of ruining me. If they cut it by 2/6D, I might accuse them of insulting me. If you want to know what 2/6D is, let's look up British non-decimal currency. And in Britain, let's see, United Kingdom, £1 was 4 crowns, was 20 shillings, was 240 pence, was 960 farthings, and I think 2/6D meant £2 and 6 shillings. And so if if my boss cuts my salary entirely, they're trying to ruin me. But if they cut my salary by $2, I think they're insulting me. If they cut my salary by $1,000, it's not clear what they're trying to do. But if someone cuts your salary by $2, it's clear that they mean something by that. They're not just doing it because it's for some other reason. Perhaps then we might make the following generalizations. 1. A meant something by X is roughly equivalent to A intended the utterance of X to produce some effect in an audience by means of the recognition of this intention. And we may add that to ask what A meant is to ask for a specification of the intended effect. Though, of course, it may not always be possible to get a straight answer involving a that clause, for example, a belief that. 2. X meant something is roughly equivalent to somebody meant something by X. So that is, the bell means something, or the cut in my salary meant that I was to be insulted. Here again, there will be cases where this will not quite work. I feel inclined to say that, as regards traffic lights, the change to red meant the traffic was to stop, but it would be very unnatural to say somebody meant by the red light change that the traffic was to stop. Nevertheless, there does seem to be some sort of reference to somebody's intentions. I think traffic lights are a really good example of this sort of meaning. They clearly mean something because they are intended to be recognized as having that meaning. If you didn't know that red meant stop and that green meant go, you wouldn't have that belief. And if you thought that you were just watching TV, you wouldn't be affected by those red and green lights the same way as when you're actually driving. 3. X, the utterance, means in a timeless sense that so-and-so might, as a first shot, be equated with some statement or disjunction of statements. Disjunction means or, a collection of things, of statements about what people, vaguely, have intended, with qualifications about recognition, to effect by X. I shall have a word to say about this. Will any kind of intended effect do, or may there be cases where an effect is intended with the required qualifications, and yet we should not want to talk of meaning? Suppose I discovered some person so constituted that, when I told him that whenever I grunted in a special way I wanted him to blush, or to incur some physical malady, thereafter, whenever he recognized the grunt and with it my intention, he did blush or incur the malady. Should we then want to say that the grunt meant something? I do not think so. This is a weird case. It's a bit hard for me to understand. Maybe we'll have something to say about it in class. This points to the fact that for X to have meaning, the intended effect must be something which is in some sense is within control of the audience, or that in some sense of reason, the recognition of the intention behind X is for the audience a reason and not merely a cause. And here, this distinction between reasons and causes is a really important one in philosophy generally, in ethics, in language, in all sorts of things. It might look as if there's a sort of pun here, a reason for believing and a reason for doing, but I do not think this is serious. That is, he's saying, it's not obvious that reasons for belief are the same as reasons for action. But this is an important philosophical discussion. He thinks that these are reasons in the same sense, even though believing and doing are different kinds of things. For no doubt, from one point of view, questions about reasons for believing are questions about evidence, and so quite different from questions about reasons for doing. Nevertheless, to recognize an utterer's intention in uttering X, a descriptive utterance, to have a reason for believing that so-and-so, is at least quite like having a motive for accepting so-and-so. Decisions that seem to involve decisions to. That is, if I decide that I should go to the store, it's very much like deciding to go to the store. And this is why we can refuse to believe and be compelled to believe. That is, we're acting for or against our reasons in refusing to believe or being compelled to believe. The cutting case needs slightly different treatment, for one cannot in any straightforward sense decide to be offended, but one can refuse to be offended. We'll talk about this later in the semester when we look at words that are used specifically to offend people. That's an important class of meanings that certain words have. They intend to offend people. And, uh, and there's a question, can someone decide not to be offended? Is the recognition of the intention to offend part of recognizing the meaning? And Grice says, yes. It looks then as if the intended effect must be something within the control of the audience, or at least a sort of thing which is within its control. Now here, some philosophers in epistemology worry about whether or not beliefs really are within our control, whether I can decide to believe, but Grice is assuming we can. One point before passing to an objection or two, I think it follows that from what I have said about the connection between meaning and recognition of intention that, insofar as I'm right, only what I may call the primary intention of an utterer is relevant to the meaning of an utterance. For if I utter X, intending, with the aid of the recognition of this intention, to induce an effect E, and then intend this effect E to lead to a further effect F, then insofar as the occurrence of F is thought to be dependent solely on E, I cannot regard F as in the least dependent on recognition of my intention to induce E. So that's a mouthful. That is, I think the idea is if I tell someone that the house is on fire and intend them to get to believe that the house is on fire as a result of that, and then therefore intend them to leave the house, when I said the house is on fire, I didn't mean leave the house. I meant the house is on fire because it's only this first intention that depends on their recognition of my intention. Once they've come to have the belief that the house is on fire, they'll leave regardless of what they think my intention is. And they're not leaving because they think I want them to leave. They're leaving because they think the house is on fire, which is something they think that's the thing that they think because they think I want them to believe it. That is, if I intend to get a man to do something by giving him some information, it cannot be regarded as relevant to the meaning of my utterance to describe what I intend him to do. And that's my example, that it's the information that's meant, not what he does. Now, some question may be raised about my use, fairly free, of such words as intention and recognition. And I think here he's engaging with the behaviorist philosophers and psychologists. They are not happy with all this talk about stuff going on inside the head. I must disclaim any intention of peopling all our talking life with armies of complicated psychological occurrences. I do not hope to solve any philosophical puzzles about intending, but I do want briefly to argue that no special difficulties are raised by my use of the word intention in connection with meaning. First, there will be cases where an utterance is accompanied or preceded by a conscious plan or explicit formulation of intention. E.g., I declare how I am going to use X or ask myself how to get something across. This is what happens all the time in mathematical dialogue or in someone who's consciously writing a speech or writing a paper. They might say, in this talk, I intend to mean by meaning this kind of thing, not that kind of thing. And that's how Grice begins. Or someone who's trying to write a speech might think, what is the best way to get my audience to understand what it is I'm trying to say? And this is what all of us should be doing when we're writing. The presence of such an explicit plan obviously counts fairly heavily in favor of the utterer's intention, meaning being as planned, though it is not, I think, conclusive. For example, a speaker who has declared an intention to use a familiar expression in an unfamiliar way may slip into the familiar use. I think I've used the word meaning in this reading several times. I've used the word mean in the phrase by means of, which is completely different from all the stuff about meaning. Similarly, in non-linguistic cases, if we're asking about an agent's intention, a previous expression counts heavily. Nevertheless, a man might plan to throw a letter in the dustbin and yet take it to the post. When lifting his hand, he might come to and say either, I didn't intend to do this at all, or I suppose I must have been intending to put it in. Explicitly formulated linguistic or quasi-linguistic intentions are no doubt comparatively rare. That is, people don't often say what they're going to do what they're trying to do when they say something. In their absence, we would seem to rely on very much the same kinds of criteria as we do in the case of non-linguistic intentions where there is a general usage. An utterer is held to intend to convey what is normally conveyed, or normally intended to be conveyed, and we require a good reason for accepting that a particular use diverges from this general usage. So that is, uh, if we want to know how is it that you know what someone intends when they use some words, well, the idea is normally, sometimes we can recognize what the person's trying to do, but in other cases, I don't know this person. I don't know what they might be trying to do, but I know the words they're using, and I know that other people use the words to try to do something. So I assume this person's probably trying to do the same thing. And so I think this is where he's getting to the idea that semantic meaning, the meaning of the words, comes from a pattern of speakers using the words with a certain intention, but how we recognize speakers' intentions on particular cases often works by being familiar with the semantic patterns. The first time someone uses a word for you, you have to understand from context what they intend. But once you've heard it that way, you can get a much better sense of what future people might be meaning by the same word. Similarly, in non-linguistic cases, we are presumed to intend the normal consequences of our actions. If someone goes up to a tap and turns it, I assume they intended to get water to come out of the tap, or intended to get the water to stop, because I know that's what normally happens, and I assume they know that's what normally happens. But I, strictly speaking, don't actually know what's going on in their head. Again, in cases where there is doubt, say, about which of two or more things an utterer intends to convey, we tend to refer to the context, linguistic or otherwise, of the utterance and ask which of the alternatives would be relevant to other things that he's saying or doing. Which intention in a particular situation would fit in with some purpose he obviously has. E.g., a man who calls for a pump at a fire would not want a bicycle pump. I think in British English they might refer to the fire hose as some sort of pump, but they probably want a water pump to get water pressure. Non-linguistic parallels are obvious. Context is a criterion in settling the question of why a man who has just put a cigarette in his mouth has put his hand in his pocket. Relevance to an obvious end is a criterion in settling why a man is running away from a bull. In that case, it's probably because he doesn't want to get gored by the bull. In certain linguistic cases, we ask the utterer afterward about his intention, and in a few of these cases, the very difficult ones, like a philosopher asked to explain the meaning of an unclear passage in one of his works, the answer is not based on what he remembers, but is more like a decision about how what he said is to be taken. I cannot find a non-linguistic parallel here, but the case is so special as not to seem to contribute a vital difference. All this is very obvious, but surely to show that the criteria for judging linguistic intentions are very like the criteria for judging non-linguistic intentions is to show that linguistic intentions are very like non-linguistic intentions. Okay, so that's Grice's account of meaning, and we will discuss this in class on Tuesday.